You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood, art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today we're looking at an absolutely incredible artist by the name of Wolfgang Beltracchi. I say he was incredible because he was not particularly credible. He was a forger. Before I get into his story, though, I want to take a moment to remind everyone I'm currently posting daily mini episodes in the run-up to my annual Arts Madness tournament. Starting Monday, February 24th, I'll open up voting in our round 1 matches, and every week half will be eliminated until we are down to just one ultimate winner. Right now at whoartedpodcast.com/vote, you can fill out a form telling me which artists you think will come out on top of this year's tournament. And at the end, I'll randomly select a few people who correctly predicted the winner and send them some Amazon gift cards. As always, I'll be using my ad revenue from this month to pick up the prizes, so the more you listen, the more I can give away this spring. Now, on to the actual topic for today. Wolfgang Beltracchi. Wolfgang Beltracchi is possibly the greatest art forger in the history of the world. His ability to take on other identities is so thorough that Beltracchi isn't even his given name. He met Heinrink Campendonk in 1992, and after they married in 1993, he took her name. He was born Wolfgang Fischer in Höxter, Germany, February 4th, 1951. Growing up, he says his parents were both traumatized by World War II, but they didn't really talk about it. His mother had been forced to flee her home in the countryside, and his father had spent years in a POW camp. He says there was a heaviness that the entire family felt but didn't discuss. I've read it described as Wolfgang and the other children feeling sort of a survivor's guilt. As Wolfgang was growing up, his father worked restoring paintings in churches, and Wolfgang assisted him learning the craft. Beltracchi says that when he was 12 years old, his father, obviously an art lover, was working on a master study painting of his own version of a Picasso. Wolfgang decided to give it a try, and much like the old story of Leonardo da Vinci, Wolfgang dashed off a painting so exquisitely rendered, his father put down his brush. As forgers go, I find Beltracchi to be really interesting because he didn't exactly paint copies of artworks. He studied and got into the mindset of the artist. He would compare his approach to the technique of method actors who would stay in character even when the camera stopped rolling. He would scour primary sources like letters and journals from the artist. He would travel to view known works in museums, and looking over the catalog, he would find some pieces that were described as having been created by the artist, but not photographed, and the image lost to history. He would then paint his own work from imagination, but based on the style of the artist. In an interview, he talked about how he would do this. As Wolfgang explained it, quote, Ernst was a very typical example. He always painted series, always in a specific way. In one series, for example, he painted crowds, and in the next, forests. So what was missing was a painting featuring crowds and forests together. A transition picture, you might say. And that's the picture I painted, end quote. A painting that looks like the work of a famous artist is one thing, but provenance, the records of ownership, the history of a piece, that's much harder to fake. To help authenticate, he would sometimes produce photographs, and these photos were genius forgeries in their own right. He would go to flea markets and buy old cameras, old film, and photographic papers, enlargers, all authentic to the age of the photo he was trying to fake. He then took a picture of his painting in what appeared to be a group show. Like any great work of historical fiction, he based it around real events, but then added his own little embellishments. For example, he would research and find a still life exhibition that actually happened in 1924, but was not actually photographed. He would then use cameras and equipment from the 1920s and take a photo of his painting claiming it was exhibited in that show. To top it all off, he forged a note from the gallery's former owner to a collector who is known to have purchased works from that gallery. The gallery owner, of course, was deceased at that point, so in no position to call BS on it. But it was so perfectly executed, that gallery owner's son said he immediately recognized his father's signature and vouched for its authenticity. Now, doing all of this would be a lot of work for one man to carry off by himself. So Wolfgang enlisted his wife Helene to create a rich and compelling backstory. Sometimes he would have her dress in period clothing, staging photographs with Helene pretending to be her own grandmother to show the works in her grandparents' collection, so to speak. And they said that collection had been acquired to protect it from Nazis. It was a believable lie because a lot of artworks were shuffled around in World War II. Museums crated up masterpieces and sent them away to protect what they could. Nazis famously plundered artworks throughout the war, and the rest of the world did what they could to save themselves and their culture from the Nazis. While I would never advocate for lying or forgery, I do have to acknowledge the tremendous skill in pulling all this off. I mean, the man clearly had some talents, not just for painting, but he also worked hard at every aspect of the game. Wolfgang is said to be really high in empathy, and he would come to identify with the artist whose work he was creating. He didn't just read biographies. He read their letters, traveled to see the world through their eyes. He would visit landscapes that inspired works, viewing them at the same time of year and the same time of day as the original artist. After completing the paintings, he created documents to support the story behind the work. It all seemed to fit together so perfectly. It seems amazing this con fell apart. But obviously it did, or Beltracchi wouldn't be the subject of this episode. His fraud was eventually discovered because of a little bit of titanium white. He was working on a painting he would later sell as the work of Heinrink Campendonk, a painter who had been part of the Blue Rider group around 1912. He was in with Franz Marc, Vasily Kandinsky, all of that. And he was among the modernists ridiculed by the Nazi degenerate art show. He fled Germany for the Netherlands, so obviously it would make sense for some of his works to have gone missing, to have some gaps in the provenance. Anyways, Beltracchi was working on a, quote, Campendonk painting, but he had run out of zinc white. Rather than mix up some more of his own, he bought some, and unbeknownst to him, there was a bit of titanium in the manufactured white. Now, for a normal artist, this wouldn't be a big deal, but that pigment was not around at the time Campendonk would have painted his piece. So when it was tested, there was undeniable evidence that the painting was a fraud. There were those who had suspicions prior to that. There was talk about exhibition title cards with a stamp identifying them with a certain gallery, stamped with a character that seemed out of character for the serious curator. While those kinds of details might raise eyebrows, it takes hard evidence to call someone out as a fraud. Beltracchi had indicated he thinks a lot of people don't want to know the truth about works of questionable authenticity. And I would suspect there's a certain amount of self-deception in all of this, as many of the people who were conned by the fraudulent paintings were able to resell them at a profit before any of this was exposed. While Beltracchi has admitted to forging about a dozen works, he's also indicated he produced hundreds of other forgeries that weren't questioned. And forgery in the art world is a bigger problem than you might expect. It's hard to pin down a number, but I've read expert estimates ranging from 20 to 40% of works in museums around the world may be fakes. Of course, all museums try to do their due diligence, and the most prestigious museums tend to be extremely cautious in their acquisitions. But there's a lot of fake artwork floating around. If you add in works in the private market, private collections and all that, the estimate may be as high as 50% of artworks in the market being forgeries. But I think the greatest bit in this whole story is how Beltracchi got caught. I read an interview with him after he got out of prison, and just like the lack of self-awareness on this is delightful. He seemed outraged that the manufacturer would label their paint as zinc white when it was in fact titanium. The great art forger was brought down by mislabeled paint. I mean, the irony, it just feels too good to be true.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.